Darren Mills and Colin "Spud" Spencer thought they were about to pull off the cleverest smuggling job Britain had ever seen, but within hours, their plan collapsed into one of the most laughable crimes in UK history. Armed with nothing more than a battered van, a handful of plastic garden gnomes, and an astonishing lack of common sense, these two small-town dreamers set out to outsmart border control. What followed was a chain of blunders so absurd that even seasoned investigators couldn't believe it was real. This is the unbelievable story of Britain's most stupid smugglers, a tale of greed, glue and gnomes that turned two ordinary men into accidental legends. Darren Mills had spent most of his 34 years drifting between temporary jobs, always convinced that something better was just around the corner. He'd been a delivery driver, a car washer, and even briefly worked at a fish market before quitting after 2 days. His best mate, Colin "Spud" Spencer, wasn't doing much better. Spud had been on and off benefits for years, living in his mum's old council flat and spending most of his time down at the pub. The two of them had grown up together in Dover, a place where people talked about making something of themselves but rarely ever did. On quiet nights, they'd sit outside the pub with pints in hand, watching the ferries cross the channel and wondering how so many others managed to escape their dead-end lives. It was during one of these late-night sessions that the idea first began to form. They'd been watching a YouTube video about drug smugglers who'd managed to sneak huge amounts of cocaine into the UK inside crates of fruit. The criminals in the video were smooth, confident, and rich, everything Darren and Spud weren't. As they watched, the two started joking about how easy it looked. If those people could pull it off, why couldn't they? It was a ridiculous thought, but for two men desperate for excitement and money, it didn't seem entirely impossible. Over the next few weeks, the joke started to feel like a plan. Darren convinced himself that they were clever enough to find a way. He'd always believed he was smarter than the people around him, even if nothing he'd ever tried had worked out. Spud, on the other hand, was more cautious. But he liked the idea of being part of something that felt big. It wasn't just about money. It was about proving that they weren't just nobodies. They wanted to shock everyone who'd ever looked down on them. They spent evenings researching online, looking for stories of successful smuggling operations. Most of what they read made little sense to them, but that didn't stop Darren from claiming he'd figured out the system. He became obsessed with the idea that customs officers never checked certain types of cargo, especially ordinary household goods. He convinced Spud that they could bring drugs into the country hidden among items so boring that no one would think twice about them. The more they talked about it, the more real it became. One night, as they sat surrounded by empty beer bottles, Darren announced that he'd found their perfect cover, garden ornaments. He explained that no one would ever suspect two ordinary blokes of smuggling drugs inside plastic gnomes. Spud laughed at first, but Darren's enthusiasm was contagious. Within days they were visiting local garden centers, inspecting decorations and pretending they were starting a landscaping business. They even came up with a fake company name, Mills Garden Supplies, which Darren scrawled on a piece of cardboard and taped to his old van. In their minds, they were on the brink of something big. They talked about what they'd do with the money, the cars they'd buy, the holidays they'd take, the way people would finally respect them. Neither of them stopped to think about what would happen if it all went wrong. They were too busy dreaming of riches and recognition. To them it wasn't crime. It was opportunity. What they didn't realize was that their lack of experience, planning, and basic common sense would soon make them not the clever criminals they hoped to be, but the laughingstock of British smuggling history. Darren's plan sounded almost brilliant when he explained it, at least to himself. He said the key to a good smuggling operation was to look boring, to appear so ordinary that nobody would ever look twice. His theory was simple. If they acted like legitimate delivery men carrying harmless products, customs would just wave them through. What could be more harmless than a load of garden furniture and a few cheerful gnomes? In his mind it was foolproof. In reality, it was a disaster waiting to happen. They started by collecting supplies from local shops and online listings. Darren used what little savings he had to buy 20 garden gnomes from a clearance sale. Each one was about 2 feet tall, grinning with a painted fishing rod or a watering can. The plastic felt thin and cheap, but that suited their plan just fine. Spud was in charge of tools and materials. He borrowed an old power drill from his cousin and bought a tube of sealant from the discount store down the road. The two set up their workshop in Darren's shed, a damp, cluttered space behind his flat that smelled of petrol and mildew. They worked through the night, drilling holes into the base of each gnome. The sound echoed through the neighborhood, and a neighbor even shouted at them to keep it down. Inside the holes they packed small bags of white powder they'd bought from a contact in Amsterdam. Darren kept saying how professional it all looked, though the glue he used to reseal the gnomes left sticky smudges and uneven seams. Spud worried that someone might notice, but Darren brushed it off, insisting no customs officer would ever get close enough to look. When they finished, they lined up the gnomes proudly along the shed wall. To them it looked like the start of an empire. Next, they needed a convincing story. Darren decided they were running a small landscaping company, supposedly delivering stock to a garden center in England. He even went as far as printing fake invoices on his old computer, listing the gnomes as decorative ornaments. The printer ink ran out halfway through, leaving the documents patchy and uneven, but he didn't care. It was enough to make the plan feel official. To complete the disguise, he scribbled Mills Garden Supplies on the side of his van with a thick black marker. Unfortunately, he misspelled supplies as supplies, a mistake that Spud noticed immediately. Darren laughed it off, saying, "No one reads the sides of vans anyway." As the day of the trip approached, their confidence grew. They told their friends they had a new business deal in Europe, something to do with importing decorative goods. Neither could keep the story straight, but no one really questioned it. Everyone knew Darren was always chasing strange ideas. They booked a ferry from Calais to Dover, planning to drive to Amsterdam first, load the goods and then return home with their hidden cargo. Darren spent the night before the journey boasting about how easy it would be, comparing himself to the clever criminals from the documentaries they used to watch. What they didn't realize was that every detail of their plan, from the sloppy gnome repairs to the fake documents, was filled with red flags. The van was unregistered for business use, the receipts were obviously fake, and their names were already in the local police database for minor offenses. To anyone else, it was clear they were amateurs pretending to be professionals, but in their minds, they were on the verge of pulling off something huge. They didn't see the holes in their plan, they only saw the promise of fast cash and bragging rights. It was the kind of reckless confidence that only the truly foolish can carry, and it was about to lead them straight into disaster. The morning of the trip arrived gray and damp, with a thin drizzle coating the streets of Dover. Darren was already up before sunrise, pacing around his flat while double-checking a list he had scribbled on the back of an envelope. He kept muttering to himself, convinced that everything was falling perfectly into place. The gnomes were packed tightly in the back of his old white van, wrapped in cheap plastic sheeting and surrounded by bits of garden furniture they'd borrowed from Spud's mum's backyard. To anyone glancing through the windows, it looked like a messy delivery of lawn ornaments. To Darren, it looked like the future. Spud arrived half an hour late, yawning and clutching a can of energy drink. He wasn't nearly as excited as Darren. The reality of what they were doing had finally started to hit him. He knew that if they were caught, it wouldn't just be a slap on the wrist. This was serious prison time. Darren, however, brushed off every concern. He claimed that customs officers only check people who looked nervous, and if they just acted normal, they'd sail right through. He even wore a fluorescent vest to look more official, though it still had a stain from when he'd used it for painting last summer. Before setting off, Darren stood back to admire the van. The words Mills Garden Supplies were still scrawled proudly on the side, crooked and misspelled, but he believed it gave them an air of legitimacy. He even stuck a faded air freshener shaped like a pine tree to the dashboard, declaring that details matter. Spud simply nodded, too tired to argue. As they pulled out of the narrow street and headed toward the ferry port, the van rattled and groaned, the sound of the gnomes clinking together echoing from the back. The journey across the channel felt longer than usual. On the ferry, Darren couldn't sit still. He wandered around the deck, glancing nervously at other passengers, half convinced that someone would somehow guess what they were doing. Spud sat quietly in the corner of the cafe, eating a bacon sandwich and trying not to think about the fact that their entire plan depended on a handful of glued plastic ornaments. To calm his nerves, he started taking photos, a few of the ferry, one of Darren pretending to look serious next to the van, and most disastrously, a picture of the gnomes themselves. He uploaded them to his social media, with the caption, "Big business trip, big deals coming soon." At the time it seemed harmless. Later, it would be one of the main pieces of evidence used against them. When the ferry reached Calais, Darren's energy returned. He drove confidently through the French roads, humming along to the radio as if they were on a normal delivery run. They reached Amsterdam late that night, meeting their supplier in a dimly lit warehouse near the dock. The exchange was clumsy but quick. The supplier clearly thought they were idiots and wanted them gone as soon as possible. Still, Darren was thrilled. To him, this was the moment he'd always dreamed about. The point of no return, where he was finally part of something bigger. As they began their drive back toward the coast, the van heavy with its illegal cargo, the air between them grew tense. Every passing police car made Spud's stomach twist. Darren, meanwhile, was already planning how to spend the profits. He talked about buying a sports car and moving somewhere nicer. He even said he might open a real garden supply shop, just for the irony. But beneath his bravado there was a hint of fear he couldn't quite hide. The ferry port at Calais loomed ahead, and for the first time, even Darren began to wonder whether they were truly invisible, or whether someone was already watching them. By the time they reached the ferry terminal in Calais, the sky had darkened, and rain streaked the van's dusty windows. The sea breeze carried a sharp chill that crept under their clothes, adding to the growing unease that neither of them dared to admit. Darren tried to act confident, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel as the queue inched forward. He told himself that everything was going according to plan. The van looked ordinary, their paperwork was good enough, and as long as they kept calm, no one would look twice. But inside, his stomach churned with every glance from a nearby officer. Spud sat silently, gripping the edge of his seat. His earlier excitement had vanished completely. The closer they got to the customs checkpoint, the more he regretted every decision that had led him there. He kept thinking about the gnomes in the back, each one stuffed with cocaine and glued shut with cheap bathroom sealant. The smell of the glue still lingered faintly in the van, mixing with the damp air. To him it was a reminder of how fragile their so-called plan really was. The queue moved slowly. Cars rolled forward one by one as officers walked between lanes with sniffer dogs. Darren kept his eyes fixed on the vehicle in front, avoiding any unnecessary movements. He tried to look relaxed, even yawning dramatically, to show he wasn't nervous. It didn't help. The more he tried to act casual, the more suspicious he appeared. His constant fidgeting drew glances from the customs officers nearby, one of whom began to make his way toward their lane. When the officer tapped on the window and asked them to pull aside for a quick inspection, Darren's heart dropped. He forced a grin and mumbled something about just garden supplies, but his voice trembled slightly. Spud could feel his hands sweating as he tried to appear calm. The officer signaled to another colleague, and soon a uniformed team was standing beside the van with a sniffer dog wagging its tail eagerly. The dog circled the vehicle once, then twice. Its nose pressed against the back doors, and it began scratching and barking. Darren's forced smile froze on his face. The officer raised an eyebrow and asked him to open the back. With shaky hands, Darren stepped out, fumbling with the latch. As the doors swung open, the smell of glue and plastic filled the air. Rows of brightly colored gnomes stared back at the officers, their painted smiles oddly sinister under the dim lights. The officers exchanged amused glances. One of them crouched down, inspecting a gnome closely, while the dog barked wildly beside him. Spud blurted out a rushed explanation about a wedding delivery and emergency garden decorations, But his words only made things worse. The lead officer asked them to step away from the van while his team examined the cargo. Darren tried to stay composed, though his face had turned pale. Every second felt like an hour as the officers tapped, lifted and examined the gnomes. When the dog began barking louder, scratching at one in particular, the officer picked it up and gave it a firm shake. Something rattled inside. Darren's throat tightened. The officer set it on the ground and called for a tool to open the base. Spud muttered under his breath, praying they wouldn't notice anything. But before anyone could fetch a tool, the worst possible thing happened. The sealant on the bottom began to soften from the heat of the van's engine. A faint crack appeared, and then a puff of white powder spilled out onto the officer's boots. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then chaos erupted. The officers shouted. The dog barked louder, and Spud felt his knees give way. Darren stammered something about decorative sand as he was handcuffed, his voice cracking. Within minutes, their van was surrounded, and their foolish dream was shattered. What they had believed was a clever plan had just turned into one of the most ridiculous busts in British smuggling history. The moment the gnome cracked open, everything spiraled into chaos. The air seemed to freeze as white powder spilled out in a small cloud around the officer's boots. For a split second, Darren tried to convince himself it was just a trick of the light, that maybe the sealant had crumbled into dust. But then one of the officers knelt down, dipped a gloved finger into the powder, and looked up sharply. The look on his face said everything. Darren felt his chest tighten as if the air had been sucked out of the world. Spud's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The game was up. Within seconds, the calm routine of the checkpoint exploded into activity. Officers shouted commands to each other, more vehicles were halted, and several customs agents surrounded the van. The sniffer dog barked non-stop, pulling at its lead as if demanding to tear the rest of the gnomes apart. Darren stood frozen, his hands shaking as one of the officers told him to step back. Spud's knees buckled, and he dropped onto the wet concrete, staring blankly at the broken gnome lying in the officer's hand. The officers began lining the gnomes up on the ground one by one. Each of them was cracked open, revealing the same hidden packages. Some of the gnomes fell apart before anyone even touched them, the cheap glue melting under the midday sun. What was supposed to be their brilliant smuggling method had turned into a pitiful display of plastic rubble and white dust. Passers-by waiting in nearby vehicles leaned out of their windows to watch, whispering and laughing as they realized what was happening. Darren could hear fragments of their comments, words like idiots and unbelievable cut through the noise. One of the officers read them their rights while another photographed the scene. Darren barely listened. His mind spun in circles, trying to make sense of how quickly everything had fallen apart. Just hours earlier he had been bragging that they were about to make more money than they'd ever dreamed of. Now standing there in the drizzle, he felt like a child who'd been caught stealing sweets. He muttered something about it being a mistake, insisting they didn't know what was in the gnomes, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew how ridiculous they sounded. Spud had completely shut down. He sat on the curb, pale and silent, as an officer handcuffed him and led him to a police van. When one of the customs agents asked what they'd been thinking, Darren didn't answer. There was no clever excuse left to give. Everything about their plan, from the misspelled company name to the glued gnomes, was pure stupidity laid bare for the world to see. Inside the customs office, officers catalogued each gnome and weighed the recovered drugs. The total street value was far higher than Darren or Spud had ever imagined. Their foolish attempt had accidentally put them in the same category as serious smugglers, but without the skill or sense to match. Darren stared at the evidence table, where rows of headless garden gnomes sat under bright fluorescent lights, each tagged and photographed. It looked absurd, almost comedic, but the reality was crushing. When they were finally told they'd be transferred to Dover for questioning, Darren's bravado was gone. His head hung low as he was escorted to a police van, rain dripping from his hair. Spud, still pale and silent, avoided eye contact altogether. The ferry back to England was quiet, filled only with the hum of the engines and the occasional creak of the handcuffs. Neither of them spoke a word. The dream of easy money had ended on a cold stretch of tarmac, surrounded by laughing officers and broken plastic gnomes. A fittingly pathetic end to Britain's most foolish smuggling scheme. Back in Dover, the arrest of Darren Mills and Colin Spud Spencer quickly became the talk of the town. News spread fast, first among the customs officers, then across social media, and within a day, their story was making headlines. The two men who had tried to smuggle cocaine inside garden gnomes were suddenly infamous. As the police van pulled into the station yard, the pair sat in silence, each lost in the heavy fog of regret. Darren still couldn't believe how quickly it had all fallen apart. Just the day before, he'd been convinced he was about to change his life forever. Now, he was being photographed, fingerprinted, and locked in a cold cell that smelled faintly of bleach and stale air. The investigation began immediately. Detectives from the National Crime Agency were brought in, more curious than concerned. They had seen plenty of drug smugglers before, but never anything quite as absurd as this. The officers handling the case could hardly keep a straight face as they examined the evidence. On the evidence table lay 20 garden gnomes in various states of destruction. Some cracked open, others still half covered in melted glue. Each one contained packets of high-purity cocaine worth thousands of pounds. To the professionals, it was clear these two weren't part of any organized crime network. They were amateurs, who had stumbled into something far beyond their understanding. When investigators checked Darren and Spud's phones, the evidence was almost too easy to find. Their text messages read like a guide to how not to commit a crime. There were messages about buying glue, drilling holes, and even one where Darren had written, "No one will ever check a gnome, mate." Spud's phone contained the now infamous selfies he'd taken with the van and the caption "Big business trip. Big deals coming soon." The timestamps matched their ferry tickets perfectly, leaving no doubt about what they'd been doing. The detectives could hardly believe their luck. It was as if Darren and Spud had documented their own downfall step by step. Tracing the drugs back to their source didn't take long. The supplier in Amsterdam was a small-time dealer with connections to a larger network. When questioned, he admitted that he'd warned the two men that smuggling was dangerous and that their plan was ridiculous. He'd assumed they were joking when they mentioned garden gnomes. By the time he realized they were serious, they'd already left the country with the goods. His testimony painted a clear picture. Darren and Spud weren't professional smugglers at all, just desperate men blinded by greed and stupidity. As the evidence piled up, so did the ridicule. The media ran with the story, calling them the gnome smugglers of Dover and Britain's most baffling criminals. News anchors laughed as they described how the sealant had melted, spilling cocaine all over customs officers' boots. Photos of the cracked gnomes appeared in newspapers across the country. Darren's misspelled company name, Mills Garden Supplies, became an internet meme overnight. Even local radio stations mocked them, with callers joking about setting up gnome security checks at ferry ports. Meanwhile, in their separate holding cells, the two men were beginning to realize just how much trouble they were in. Darren tried to maintain his confidence, insisting that he could explain everything once he got a lawyer, but even he couldn't ignore the mountain of evidence. Spud, on the other hand, was a broken man. He spent most of his time staring at the wall, mumbling about how he should have stayed home. When detectives finally interviewed them, both stories were a mess. Darren claimed he thought the gnomes contained lethal substances, while Spud insisted he hadn't known anything about the drugs at all. Neither explanation convinced anyone. By the time they were charged with smuggling and possession with intent to distribute, the case had become a national joke. For the police, it was one of the easiest convictions they'd ever secure. For Darren and Spud, it was the beginning of the longest, most humiliating chapter of their lives. One that would follow them long after the courtroom lights went out. The trial of Darren Mills and Colin Spud Spencer began on a drizzly Monday morning at Canterbury Crown Court, drawing far more attention than either man could have imagined. By then their story had spread across the country. Reporters crowded the steps outside the courthouse, snapping photos and shouting questions as the pair were led in, both wearing borrowed suits that didn't quite fit. Darren tried to keep his chin up, but his nervous fidgeting gave him away. Spud followed behind, looking pale and defeated, as though he had already accepted his fate. Inside, the courtroom was packed with journalists, curious locals, and even a few people who had shown up just to watch what was being called the most ridiculous smuggling case in British history. The prosecution wasted no time laying out the evidence. They presented the photos from the border inspection, showing the rows of gnomes lined up on the tarmac, their broken bases spilling white powder. The lead customs officer took the stand and explained how the sealant had melted, revealing the cocaine inside. His calm description of events drew muffled laughter from the audience more than once. When the prosecutor displayed one of the actual gnomes in court, now cleaned and tagged as evidence, the absurdity of the situation became impossible to ignore. The judge had to pause the proceedings when a few people in the gallery couldn't stop laughing. Darren sat stiffly throughout, his jaw clenched, trying to appear calm. He had convinced himself that if he looked serious and spoke clearly, the jury might see him as unlucky rather than foolish. His lawyer argued that Darren and Spud had been manipulated by more dangerous individuals, that they had no real idea what they were transporting. But that argument quickly fell apart when the prosecution read aloud their text messages. The courtroom chuckled as one of Darren's messages was quoted. "No one checks garden gnomes, we're golden." Even the judge couldn't hide a faint smirk. Spud's lawyer attempted a different approach, painting him as a simple man who had gone along with a bad idea out of loyalty to his friend. That defense earned a bit more sympathy, but the evidence was overwhelming. Photos, ferry tickets, phone records, everything lined up perfectly. The jury listened patiently as both sides presented their arguments, though the outcome was already clear to everyone in the room. By the third day, the case had taken on the air of dark comedy. Newspapers called it the Gnome Trial, and TV stations ran nightly segments highlighting the more absurd details. Darren's misspelled company name was projected on the courtroom screen at one point, prompting another wave of laughter. The prosecutor summed it up best when he said, "This was not a sophisticated criminal enterprise, it was a farce." When the verdict finally came, it was unanimous, guilty on all counts. The judge, maintaining as much composure as he could, delivered a scathing but almost pitying speech before sentencing. He said their actions were staggeringly incompetent, and a cautionary tale of greed without intelligence. Darren was sentenced to 6 years in prison, while Spud received 5, his lighter punishment reflecting his smaller role in the plan. As they were led away, neither man spoke. Darren's earlier arrogance had vanished, replaced by a hollow stare. Spud glanced once toward the public gallery, where a few people were still quietly laughing. In that moment, the full weight of their foolishness settled over them. They hadn't just failed at smuggling, they'd become a national punchline. Their names, once unknown, would forever be linked to the image of shattered plastic gnomes, and a plan so stupid it seemed almost unbelievable. Outside the courthouse, reporters called it justice served. But for Darren and Spud, it felt more like a lifetime of humiliation just beginning. In the months following their sentencing, Darren Mills and Colin Spud Spencer faded from the headlines. But their story refused to die. What began as a short news item about a failed smuggling attempt grew into a full-blown internet sensation. Memes flooded social media, depicting grinning garden gnomes wearing sunglasses and captions like, "Keep it low, keep it gnome." Talk shows mocked them, comedians worked them into stand-up routines, and late-night hosts described their operation as the most British crime ever committed. For a time, it seemed as though the entire country was laughing at two men who had believed they could outsmart the system with nothing but glue, plastic, and misplaced confidence. In prison, the laughter echoed in other ways. Darren quickly discovered that notoriety didn't translate into respect behind bars. Other inmates mocked him constantly, calling him Gnome Guy or Mr. Supplies, referencing the misspelling on his van. At first he tried to embrace it, claiming he didn't care what people thought, but the jokes wore him down. The same arrogance that had driven him to crime began to crumble. He spent most of his days working quietly in the laundry room, replaying the events that had landed him there. Somewhere deep down, he realized that it had never been about money. It had been about pride, the desperate need to prove he was smarter than everyone else. Spud adjusted slightly better. Though he remained quiet and withdrawn, many inmates pitied him more than mocked him. It was clear to everyone that he'd been swept along by Darren's big talk and bad planning. He spent his time in the prison library, reading books about people who had made poor choices and somehow turned their lives around. For the first time in years, he started to think about doing something better when he got out. He even began attending a gardening course offered to inmates, finding an odd kind of irony in learning how to grow real plants instead of smuggling fake ornaments. Outside the prison walls, their legend continued to grow. Documentaries, podcasts and YouTube videos dissected every part of their failed operation, each one trying to understand how two ordinary men could be so spectacularly foolish. Some treated the story as comedy, while others framed it as a tragic example of desperation and delusion. The original customs officers were interviewed repeatedly, their retelling of the gnome explosion becoming a favorite moment for viewers. Even years later, the phrase "cocaine gnomes of Dover" still surfaced whenever someone mentioned Britain's strangest criminals. When Darren was finally released, after serving 4 years of his sentence, he walked out of prison to a small crowd of photographers hoping for a quote. He ignored them, keeping his head down as he disappeared into a taxi. He found work as a warehouse porter under a false name, avoiding attention wherever he could. He never spoke about the gnomes again. Spud, released a few months later, returned quietly to his mother's old house. He started doing odd gardening jobs for neighbors, trying to rebuild a normal life, even as people occasionally recognized him from the news. He'd laugh awkwardly when someone mentioned it, but deep down he wished he could forget it entirely. Their story became a lasting cautionary tale, a reminder that greed and stupidity often go hand in hand. They hadn't just broken the law, they'd made a spectacle of themselves, turning crime into comedy. Long after their release, people still told the story of the two men who thought they could fool border security with a van full of gnomes and a dream of easy money. In a way, they achieved the fame they always wanted, but not the kind that anyone would envy. Their names became part of British folklore, etched forever into the long bizarre history of crime that proves one simple truth: sometimes the line between clever and stupid is thinner than glass.